Okay. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Leslie Nickel, and as I like to call myself, the inane executive volunteer. And we're thrilled to have this session this morning with Pat and Maria and Karen from one academy to another. You know, we usually do this at the inane conference, and for last summer, we've done it a couple of years now, since 2015. And for last summer, we had planned to change the format a little bit and have it as a roundtable at breakfast. And then we know what happened last summer. So it got postponed and we didn't have the session at all. And then as we were planning for this summer, you know, we were having the conference in a virtual format. And so we won't be having a breakfast roundtable. So I talked to Karen and Pat and Maria and said, how about if we do it as a just a standalone session? So that's how this came about today. I'm thrilled at the number of people who signed up and the number of people who are here so far. This is great. We have a PowerPoint and a little bit of a presentation. And while our presenters are going through the PowerPoint, if you have questions, you can write them in the chat, you know, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So if there are things that come up right away that need to answer, you know, we'll make sure that Karen and Maria and Pat hear that. And then there'll be time at the end for a more open discussion. So without further ado, I'll just turn it over. I think Pat and Karen and Maria are well known to our inane members. And we'll spend a lot of time on a formal introduction and let them introduce themselves. So,
great.
Good morning.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And thank you all for signing up for this. We know one way or another you have some interest in this. And Leslie asked what your interest was in coming to this. And here's what I said: it doesn't matter what their interest is. Really, the questions are all the same. And the bottom line question is, how do we get either me or others into the academy? And that's what we're here to answer today. We encourage you to put your questions into the chat, and those of us, the other two who aren't talking, will be monitoring that. This is a conversation, not a presentation, although we have many slides, but we want to dialogue with you. So if we say something that you want clarification on, ask us about it at the time, rather than waiting till the end and then we're trying to figure out, well, what were we talking about that you would want clarification. As you can tell from the screen, I'm Pat. Karen is there in the yellow and waving, and Maria is there in the black, the other black, and waving. And so we're going to get started. Karen?
So we want to start with just the context. So this session is an outgrowth of the challenge that Margaret Comerford Freda posed in an aid in 2014. And what happened was she wanted to know how we could get more editors into the academy. And so consequently, we said we would be glad to do a session on what the ins and outs are of getting selected to the academy. We've been offering this every year since then, and it's a real tribute to Margaret, to her leadership and her commitment. So it's important as we start for us to understand the mission of the academy, which is to improve health and achieve health equity by impacting policy through nursing leadership, innovation, and science. And you can see that on the Academy website, but I just wanted to remind everybody of what this is all about. And that's what the Academy is about.
And now if you go to the next slide, Leslie, you're one behind. Thank you.
Hi all, this is Maria. And so we're sure that most of you have a personal goal for joining us today. It might be to add the FAN to your credentials, or perhaps to help someone else to do so. One of our major motivations since Margaret Comerford Freda challenged us in 2014 at the inane meeting is to really increase the number of editors in the American Academy of Nursing. And that's part of the reason why we have been doing this workshop from One Academy to the other since 2014. And the other thing is we want to help you to understand perhaps how you might be able to increase the competitiveness of your application or the folks that you might be sponsoring. In the next slide that includes key objectives, I just want to emphasize that some of the things that we're going to share are ways in which you might be able to really identify that distinctive contribution that you have made in your career that can form the basis or the platform, if you will, for your application. Help you to begin to think about how you might go about creating a plan. And then also to help you to think about what might be some of the resources that you need in this journey and how you might go about tapping into those. And so, Leslie, in answer to your question, we could see the slides and we're ready to move to slide number 5. Thank you.
Okay.
And I see here that we have a question, which is not everyone here is an editor. Will you be able to address those of us who are not editors? Absolutely, because what we are talking about is conceptual. It does not matter if you are an editor or not. Editors have some distinct advantages in some areas, and that will be evident. But if you are not an editor, you will see that the principle of whatever we're talking about will apply. And as we go through, if you go, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense to me, how would that apply? Please ask your question so that we're certain that you see how it applies to you. And somebody is raising this question, who can see your message recording on? I don't understand that question.
That's not a question. That's just in the chat to show the messages have been sent to everybody. So.
Oh, okay. And somebody is still not seeing the slides, Leslie.
Yeah,
David,
I know,
yeah.
David.
I'm not sure what I need to do. I'll keep punching buttons until it appears.
All right. And David, there are no secrets on the slides. We really are using the slides sort of as notes. And I'll be glad to send them to you at the end if you'll send me your email address in Key West. And they'll be a little more formal than Key West would allow, but that's okay.
Oh my, all right. I get it.
Yeah, all right. So here's some key steps and the roadmap. This is in essence the big picture of getting into the academy. If you go to the aannet.org site, you will find a self-assessment. That self-assessment is a tool that is designed to help you look at yourself to see whether or not you meet the expectations of belonging to the academy or not. So you look at that self-assessment, and let me just say right away, this is not the time to say to yourself, well, yes, but. This is the time to say, yes, I can. Yes, I am. So don't downplay any of your attributes. The most important step in the whole process, other than the self-assessment to see if you think you have it together, is to line up your sponsors. We cannot emphasize enough. Line them up typically a year in advance. And the reason is because so many of the people that you might know well enough, who know you well enough, are already been committed to somebody for next year and the year after. So you want to be sure that if you want person ABC to be one of your sponsors, you are asking them as soon as you really are thinking about becoming a member of the academy. Then you make a plan, and that plan has to include, how am I going to get my CV in shape? Who am I going to ask to review my application. And I know that Maria and I have both served as ghost reviewers, meaning we haven't sponsored the person, but we've sat back and looked at what the application looked like and then provided feedback so that the team put together could make it even stronger. And you want to make a plan that ends preferably like a month ahead of the deadline. And the reason for that is so that if at the last minute you look and go, oh my gosh, I forgot about XYZ, you have time to put in XYZ rather than racing up to the deadline and then you run over words or something like that and your application is rejected. So start early is our first message. Start early, start with the assessment, start with the sponsors. Now, this applies to editors. A good editor edits, edits, edits. A good writer edits, edits, edits. So expect a lot of feedback because the people who are going to be your sponsors hopefully will say to you, no, you haven't said that strongly enough. That's a common issue. You haven't said it strongly enough. So expect a lot of feedback. I can't emphasize enough, a lot of feedback. And sometimes you'll get tired of the amount of feedback, but it is all meant to strengthen whatever it is that you're trying to say. Because remember, even though if we think about it, you may have done fabulous things, the group that's deciding about your future in terms of the academy only sees what's on pieces of paper, or in this case, electronic records. So we've made the point about edit, edit, edit. Now you may be wondering, so I want to emphasize one thing before we go. This process, typically, the process of looking at the assessments and then going through, typically opens mid-January and closes in February. The Academy staff have said, and I quote, individuals interested in applying for fellowship should start preparing now. And the reason I'm sharing this is because theoretically, there are going to be changes in 2022. Should start preparing now by identifying sponsors and drafting their statements to support their applications. And we'll be talking about those statements in a bit. So that is what they have said. Go ahead and start now by looking at your self-assessment, which will get you to those draft statements. Start with your CV, fixing it, get your sponsors, even though the actual statements themselves may change. We doubt that they will change dramatically. So let's look at some statistics in terms of what's happened in the past.
Pat, before we move into the statistics, I wanted to share a point, and that is, even if there is a change in the requirements for the application, what we're sharing today based on the existing requirements will help you in terms of shaping your materials. Although we do not anticipate that there's going to be a dramatic change, we have been told that there will be a change and we don't know exactly what that is. So just to reinforce the fact that whatever work you put into this process now will be beneficial to you in the long run. And the second thing that I want to do is I want to answer the question that's in the chat, which is how many sponsors should one have? This process requires 2. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sponsors further on. But the main point Pat has identified, and that is to line them up early. There's going to be 2 of them. And the next thing we're going to share is we want you to think of these 2 sponsors as complementary. Thank you, Pat. So Karen, it's yours.
Yeah, let me just say that this process of reviewing the selection committee and the standards and the criteria, et cetera, seems to be ongoing. When I was on the board in the early 2000s, I chaired the committee that looked at this one more time. And so this is a process that's sort of ongoing. And this year, the committee is chaired by Karen Cox, former president of the Academy, and they are actually getting some outside help in terms of assessing how they're doing and what's going on. You can see, though, if you look at the data on this slide, that pretty much since 2007, the percentage of applicants accepted to the Academy has run in the 60s and 70s. One was as low in 2007 as 45%, but for the most part, they've been right up there. 15 and 16, as you can see, was 57% each year, and last year was 62, but in 2019 it was 75%. And I think, you know, as people learn about how to craft the application, the percentages tend to be higher. So that's the purpose of what we're doing today, is to help people look at how they craft an application for the Academy. Next slide. And I wanted to clarify. So when you go on the website, you may not be able to find something called the self-assessment tool right now, but when you look at the guidance, which is like 20-25 pages, there is something called additional guidance. And in that section of additional guidance, what you will see are all kinds of examples of various statements in the application. And what they're really looking for is your unique contributions, an explanation of the scope, reach, or spread of the work that you've done. For example, you were a lead person in a practice or policy change, or a specific kind of innovation, or a large healthcare system, or some kind of a state committee or effort. So you can see that those are the kinds of things that they look for in terms of your contributions. You could have been on a team. Teams make significant contributions, and you may have either led the team or led a subgroup of the team, and you have to be specific about what was accomplished. There are committee appointments that are considered very seriously, such as if you were appointed to a congressional committee, you've got to be able to talk about that. If you're on some kind of a major national board or a committee that's very highly selective, you can talk about, one, the nursing input for that committee and what it was that you believe was accomplished, that was through your efforts. You can develop and implement if you developed and implemented unique models for nursing, that's another one. And then Maria, you were going to talk a little bit about specific editors' contributions.
Yes, and so for example, for an editor, you are shaping a body of knowledge by the decisions that you make in terms of what gets published. And so if the platform that you're using to identify your contribution is based on your editorial background, you might want to talk about how you've shaped that discipline. Has it been through the creation of standards that didn't exist before? Policies that have been implemented to impact the workforce? Just make sure that you identify those and that you link these with the contribution and the impact, which moves us nicely into the next slide, continuing the self-assessment, because you want to be able to provide specific evidence of that outstanding and sustained contribution. And when you identify a platform, try to limit it to one or two areas of focus. What generally happens is there are individuals who apply for the Academy and are not focused enough in terms of their area of impact, because the truth is that we as nurses are impacting in multiple areas, but you want to identify your most significant and outstanding contribution that has been sustained and has been impactful. A way that you can use to really answer that question as to where your contribution is by filling the sentence, I am known for blank. And so when your name pops up, what do people think of as your contribution? And then what is the evidence that supports that? And impact is very important, and we're going to talk about that. The other point is evidence of potential to continue to contribute to nursing and the academy. And this is where it would be helpful to you to learn a little bit more about the expert panels in the academy, because your work may line up with the work of those expert panels, and you really want to be able to articulate that in your application packet. Pat, you had wanted to share an example.
So let me give you an example of somebody I sponsored who was, so to speak, piddling around with, oh, I do this and I do that, and she didn't have a theme. And so I had her talk to me. And as she talked, I said to her, listen to what you have said. You teach about quality. The research that you are doing is about quality. You are contracted to a hospital to work with their staff to develop quality improvement projects. You serve on a hospital board, and you are the voice of quality on that board and interpret to them what quality is. There is an expert panel at the academy that focuses on systems and quality. So she refocused all this stuff that was out there in multiple little baskets and put it into one big basket focused on quality. And now she could talk about how each of those elements contributed to the wholeness of quality and how each potentiated the other element. And obviously she got in on the first go around.
Next slide.
So Karen will go with the next slide.
Yes. You know, there are criteria, and one of them happens to be membership in good standing in the American Nurses Association. So if you are not an ANA member and you want to make application to the academy, you best put yourself into gear and join. Also for international applicants, membership in good standing with the National Nurses Association in their respective countries, holding membership in the ICN, that's an important criteria also. So if you know someone who's international, and many of our editors are international, that's the criteria for them to be an applicant. Now, next slide.
That is the next slide, isn't it?
Oh, I'm sorry. So specific evidence of outstanding contributions to the improvement of nursing includes the things that I discussed a little bit earlier, as well as other categories such as publications of unique work in peer-reviewed journals are heavily weighted, and publications of textbooks or similar documents are also very powerful in terms of your application. And evidence of the use of all of the articles and the textbooks and whatever else it is that you've contributed, evidence of use of those by others. And so as a journal editor, you know what's used in terms of your journal and what's cited in other references from your journal. And so if you've got that information, you could find a way to incorporate.
So the next item that we want to talk about is some examples of evidence. And some of these that are listed here, we've talked about. It's important to add your honors and awards that really reinforce your excellence in a certain area. How your work has been adopted and translated in other settings to perhaps guide education, research, administration, policy, or practice. The key point here is that your contribution be consistent and substantive. We're not talking about a flash in the pan, that you did one thing and then that was it. We're talking about consistent, substantive, and with impact. And so to provide some tangible examples, I have two examples that I wrote, and I'm going to read them to you, and I want you to focus on the language. The first example that I'm going to read is one of exemplifying your research contribution. And I just made this up, okay? So here we go. My qualitative research in XYZ contributed to the development of ABC instrument, which has created the only valid and reliable measure of such and such, and has been used across the US to affect national workforce policy. Over the course of the last 5 years, this instrument has been translated into 3 languages and tested and validated beyond the US context in France, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. Okay, so this is an example of a consistent and outstanding contribution that has occurred over time, that has been impactful, and the impact can be measured. And so when you think of your contribution, think of it from that standpoint.
So Maria,
Yes.
just think about this. For those of you who are going, oh my gosh, France, Saudi Arabia, I'm just hearing wherever I am, it might be, and the competing hospital across town uses this same tool, or it was adopted system-wide in my organization, or 3 other states use this same model. In other words, it doesn't have to be international. It can be a much smaller scale. It isn't about how dramatic it is. It is that someone else has said, wow, that's a good idea. I think I'll use it too.
Right. Thank you, Pat. And the key message here is that not only are you showing excellence where you sit, but rather that your excellence has been amplified to be used by others to advance the discipline in some way. Any other
So let
comments
me
on
just-
this one?
Yeah, let me just say something about substantive honors and awards. That does not include who's who in American nursing. Is everybody clear about that? That includes such things as being one of the outstanding leaders of your school of nursing in celebration of their 100th anniversary. Or does that make sense to people? That in fact, it really has to be substantive. It cannot be something that everybody and their brother has. And just don't include, I mean, you may have it, but don't include it in terms of the substantive honors and awards and recognitions for your application.
Being
For
a
example,
award recipient is an example of something that one would put on there.
Or employee of the month? Okay, so are we ready for the service example?
Mhm.
Okay, this is another made up one, but it captures the essence of what we're trying to communicate. So here we go. My professional contributions in the healthcare services sector entails the creation, piloting, and evaluation of the XYZ professional practice model, which was pioneered at the ABC Health System and has been used at this 3 times magnet designated health system since 1999. Since its adoption, the professional practice model has formed the foundation for professional practice models used across the United States and is described as an exemplar in a seminal Journal of Nursing Administration publication dating back to 2010. Elements of the professional practice model have been used to develop the NEAT instrument, and I made that up, I don't think there's such a thing. Used
But
by
everybody's gonna go check right now.
used by 200 magnet designated organizations in the United States to test readiness for adoption of a professional practice model in healthcare systems. So you can create an argument for your contribution as long as you include these examples of elements in the evidence that we've provided. Any questions about that one?
Could we just do a quick check by raising your hand either physically or using in the reaction, the raise the hand? From the examples that we have given you, does everybody have something that makes sense to them that they could say, yes, I've got one of those? So would you either raise your hand, okay, and David's doing thumbs up, or do the yes, thank you, the reaction tool. Judy, I don't see your hand and I know you've got it. Put your hand up.
I missed your command though, Pat. I had a guest leaving the house.
I did see some, you got a hug. Hey, that's better
know.
than whatever the question was. Okay, yes. All right, so the point is, at this point, if you cannot identify one of those pieces of evidence, you aren't giving yourself credit. I know many of you, I don't know all of you, but I know many of you. And I can tell you what some of your pieces of evidence are. So if you didn't have your hand up, come to me and I'll tell you what your pieces of evidence are. The point is, this is not the time to be shy. Write that down on a piece of paper, post it wherever you're going to work on this, and have it there that you look at it every day. This is not the time to be shy.
So Pat, Judy just made a comment. She's attending today because she's going to sponsor someone. And so can you all see how what we're talking about applies to the work the sponsor needs to do to help the applicant get their pieces in order, get their narrative written?
Right. I wasn't even thinking, you're right. Judy's already in the fellowship. Absolutely. Okay, so the point is that if you are not thinking in the best possible light about yourself, you aren't going to do your best work. So you have to think very positively. All right, so now we come to the challenge here. And you will see that we have this way or that way, which, what do I do in selecting sponsors? And those of you who are willing to be sponsors or about to be sponsors or have been asked to be sponsors, this is also a challenge for you. And I see that Karen has said, just refreshing as I get ready to sponsor a candidate. And Linda has said, also here to learn more about being a sponsor. And the real key is this: know who the other sponsor is. So if you are the primary sponsor, say to the person you are sponsoring, let's talk about who your other sponsor should be. You do not want to be sponsoring a candidate with your worst enemy, because you will just spend your time spinning wheels, and it will not be fair to the candidate, and you will not do your best. You just can't do your best work. So be sure that you say to your candidate, let's decide together who should be your other sponsor.
Pat, I would add that when you finalize who the sponsors are, a key decision in finalizing that is how committed are these sponsors to really help you? Because somebody might tell you, yes, I'll do this, but that might be at the 11th hour, I'm going to read your materials and I'm going to say, yeah, this looks just fine, check. But it takes a little bit more than that. It's helpful to invest yourself in that person. I mean, there's a commitment here, and your commitment also entails helping to craft the strategy about how best to frame this person's contributions and helping them to do so that they can be successful.
Right, and there is a bit of a way to get around that piece. It can't be just the 11th hour, but maybe the person says, well, I can only look at it a couple times. I can't attend meetings on a regular basis. So if that's what the person says, that's a clue that you should definitely engage a ghost reviewer or sponsor, whatever you want to call the person. The point being, again, that you have somebody else laying eyes on the full application, the CV, the sponsors statements, and the applicant statements, so that somebody is looking at the whole to pull it together. And so if the person who's the sponsor that can only look at it twice kind of thing, that ghost person is really filling in and supporting that person who has less time.
And what I'd like to add to that is that it's important that the sponsors that you choose really know and understand your work and what it is that you've contributed. And then we have a question in the chat about the individual being sponsored regarding whether or not the second sponsor should be someone from his or her place of employment.
Right.
That's a really great question.
Yes, that's just where I'm getting ready to talk about. Okay. So it really doesn't matter about per se about who the sponsors are, except what Karen just said. They've got to know who you are, because they've really got to talk about your work from a well-informed perspective. Now, realistically, if you have both of your sponsors from your place of employment, and let me back up and say, in the current, which is new, application process, it is not clear to the committee who the sponsors are. So they don't know if it is me, or if it is Leslie, or if it's Maria. They have no clue. However, if and we're not supposed to say in our writing things that would give clues as to our relationship with that person. However, in the writing of the sponsorship, if it sort of is clear that, like, we work with this person, and that's all you get from the sponsorship is we work with this person, it raises questions in the mind of the panel.
The committee. Mm-hmm.
Why isn't someone else supporting this person? Why isn't this person seen nationally or internationally? So the best strategy is always to have at least one person external to your organization, preferably even external to your state, because that person clearly can speak to your national or international impact. And if you are speaking to two key concepts that portray who you are, then you definitely want to have two different people who are connected in some way to those two concepts. And they may not be able to speak to it as one person. So you need the two different people. If you were an editor, you might want one who is an editor and one who is not. You might want one person who is internal to the organization, one who is not. Somebody who can speak to in great detail the nature of the impact of your research, and someone else who can speak to the kind of impact that it has had in unexpected ways that nobody would have predicted. But the real key is that what they need to be able to do is to say what you have said if you're the applicant, what you have said in your statements and in the CV. So after the sponsor has created the statement, you should look back at the sponsor statement and say, is that in the statement of the applicant or in the CV or both? And if it is not, then either it needs to go in the CV or applicant statement, or the statement in the sponsor statement needs to change.
In other words, as Pat pointed out, it all needs to align in terms of creating a powerful impact for the selection committee.
Right. So on this next slide, we'll look at the key point about the sponsor statement. Now, I'm going to point out that this sponsor statement is not to exceed 300 words. If you are applying to the Academy, you will note that everything has some word limit. It is an electronic process. Unlike writing a manuscript that says 3,000 words, if you have 3,002, very few editors say, oh, oops, you have to eliminate 2 words. No, that doesn't happen. With the Academy, the last 2 words are dropped. And so mid-sentence is how your application ends. So you really need to count the words. And it is all done automatically through the process that is used, whatever that electronic process is, I don't remember its name, in the application process. So you can't go over 300 words, but the key is make sure that you're under 300 words before you go in.
So in the chat, Pat, Lisa has asked, if you're focusing on 2 key concepts, how important is it for the 2 concepts to intersect, or can they be truly separate?
They could be truly separate if you just happen to have done 2 totally separate things. But I would encourage you to look, Lisa, to see if think about that quality example that I gave you. Is there really an intersect of those 2 key things that you think are separate, that you could use something to tie those 2 together? But
that will help you to have a more focused view.
right. So in the sponsor statement, as is true in your own statement as a candidate, the words that you use are critical, and you want to talk about impact, sustained contributions. We can't emphasize that enough, because again, it is not about, I did something wonderful once. It is, I've done something over time. It had a major influence somewhere for some period of time. And again, remember that as the sponsor writes the statement, nothing should identify who the sponsor is. And sometimes I found that particularly challenging this last time because of my relationship with the person I was sponsoring, and what I would say about the person. It was very challenging to be able to talk about that person's work without identifying the relationship that we had. So think about that as you select your candidate. Make sure your sponsor, make sure they understand they can no longer identify themselves in their sponsor statement.
Pat, there's a question in the chat from Joni. And the question is, having seen many different examples used by others, is there a preferred format for the CV when submitting the application?
Oh, what a great question. Well, here's what I would suggest in terms of a CV. And it's what I would call an impact CV. So think of it this way. You have maybe 3 columns. Over here you have years and place, and here you have position and basic role. And over here you have accomplishments. And it's that 3rd column that is all about impact. And so in that 3rd column, that's where you're deriving those words that are going to then trace back to your statement, to the sponsor's statements, and that will show a theme, if you will, of over the years I have done this, because it isn't just a listing of positions and titles. I mean, titles give us a ballpark about what you might be like and what you're doing, but it doesn't really tell us anything. You could hold a position and do nothing in some cases. So it really is about what you have done in that position. So use that column to talk about what you created, what happened as a result of that creation, what results you got, moving something from, in a clinical setting, for example, moving something from a really low engagement score to a really high engagement score, and then sustaining that, winning some kind of a press gaining award or something like that. Those are the kinds of things that the Academy is looking for.
And just remember, whatever you put in your narrative needs to match with your CV, because you can't expect that if it's in the CV, the applicant reviewer is going to know that that was part of your contribution. So look for that linkage.
And, you know, especially for our international participants, if there is some award that isn't perhaps well known in the United States, and we are very parochial in that sense, and we don't understand all those international awards, put a parenthesis and tell us this is the #1 award in Europe or something like that, so that the readers of your application understand this is really a big deal, not just, oh, it was an award, okay. That will be very helpful to the panel and as a result to you.
It's more than Employee of the Month.
Yes, yes. I think we have covered this piece and we can move on to the next slide, Karen.
Yes, so we cannot stress enough the importance of developing a plan and to start now for 2022. It's critical. Time gets very tight when you move into the fall and the formal application is released. it just, because you're right, before you know it, you're in the holidays and people are not able to respond. I mean, so start now, talk with your key sponsor now. Timing is critical in terms of how you move forward, and you have to have enough time that people can actually help you and give you feedback, rather than just kind of slapdashing everything together. Next slide. Now, use the roadmap. That's why we developed it for you. And remember, all the times we said edit, that's exactly what we meant. And so you have to be able to have time to put this together, ruminate on it, go back, rewrite it, etc. It's not just something that you dash off and send in. You have to have the blessing of your sponsor. Pat's going to talk about that too. And so that means you cannot wait to the 11th hour. You've got to have time for people to do work on the application. All of this is about so you don't get rejected, but that in fact your application is very strong the first time around that you submit it.
So I was sponsoring somebody and we're having a call close to probably the 9th or 10th hour. And I'm ready to say, okay, here are the things yet we need to do. And the person says to me, I sent it in yesterday. And I was like, oh my gosh, because there were things that needed to be fixed. So I said something tactful like, oh, okay. And thought, oh gosh, and that person didn't get in. So I immediately, when I saw that that person didn't get in, said, we're working on this right now. And the first thing I said was, and do not send it in until I tell you hit send. That was a good lesson for me. It never occurred to me to say, don't send anything till I tell you to hit send. And I learned that because this person was somebody who was like, okay, looks good to me, hit send. And so even if your sponsor doesn't tell you, don't hit send till I tell you, if the person doesn't say it, you ask, is it okay to hit send now? Got it? Don't hit send till your sponsor says hit send.
And so let's put Pat's comments into perspective. We showed you the number of applications that go in, okay? These are members of the Academy who are volunteers who serve on the Fellow Selection Committee. They are reviewing hundreds of applications. You want your application to stand out from the very beginning. You want it to be readable. You want it to be focused. You want it to be meeting the standards to enhance your chances of getting in. And that's why gaining the blessing from your sponsor is so very important, because they want you to succeed.
Next slide.
So this slide looks at an example of question 1. And remember, we talked about the fact that there might be a change, but regardless, the essence is basically going to be on summarizing your significant individual contributions and within the context of which they occur. So when you see a question like this, you want to be able to answer the question directly. So you might start this response by saying, my significant individual contributions are blank. They don't want to hear about your passions. They want to hear about your outcomes, and they want you to answer the questions, almost like that cartoon that said, the facts, ma'am, and nothing but the facts. Again, get to the point, have it be concise and thorough enough to address the significant individual contributions. And the impact, of course, is very important. So let's move to some components of this question 1. Based on the above, summarize the primary area of impact And again, I want you to notice the limit on words. So the best way to work on something like this is to work on a Word document that once the Word document is approved, then you can cut and paste into the actual application and do your final read and edits. But this question is about summarizing the primary areas of impact of your work. And so you need to respond from the standpoint of your impact. Then the next piece talks about the context in which your impact occurs. And that may vary. That doesn't necessarily have to be in a traditional environment. And editors are a perfect example of that. So make sure to read and understand the question and answer it directly.
Maria, back on A, just to be clear, you know, it says or, and that's because so many of us don't have that broad impact. But in reality, you might have created something through research that had an impact on practice that then grew to affect policy. So you could address all three areas if that were true for you. It isn't a case of choose one and only one. If you have three areas, you have all five areas to talk about it. But just so you know, it's got to be one of those areas. But if you have all, talk about all.
Thank you, Pat. And so the next slide talks about some examples of your contributions. And we've talked about these, for example, the key indicators that recognize your expertise or your contribution. Talk about the likely long-range outcomes of your influence and expand on those areas and evolve and talk about how your influence is evolving now and potentially in the future. The next slide has some examples of questions that might help you to craft and explain your contribution. So if you're talking about some sort of innovation that you have created, well, what is it? Don't assume that the reader knows exactly what it is and what it means. The extent of dissemination of that contribution to others. So is it used beyond your entity, as some of the examples that we've talked about? To what extent has it been adopted by others? And this is where you want to incorporate important measurement parameters. So for example, if you talk about that instrument that we talked about earlier, or if you talked about a publication, how many times has it been cited? How has it been used in the discipline to change policy or practice? Policy is a very important component of the academy. So you need to be able to address it, whether it's policy within your institution, within the state, the nation, or internationally. You must address policy. Talk about the nature the change has affected. If you've created something that didn't exist before, you have created a new paradigm, perhaps. So you need to explain that. And again, don't assume that others will know. And if your work has been as part of a team, you need to clarify what your role in that team has been. So if, for example, you were the member of a professional organization that created certain guidelines, did you chair the committee? Did you head the subcommittee that created X component? Did you produce the publications that translated this work that then was adopted in certain areas? So clarity is really important in amplifying your contributions.
Thank you. So in essence, you want to briefly in question 2, describe your substantive, sustained, and outstanding impact. And the focus for this application for both state or regional contributions, and identify the impact of your work beyond the state or the regional. So in addition, and I think that's a relatively straightforward thing for editors to do, because you have readership across the board. And so you can really focus on a contribution that is outside of a specific institution or even a specific state. In addition, include your potential for significant continuing contributions in this area. This is really important. And this is, as Maria said earlier, so it's not a flash in the pan. This is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing piece of work that you're doing that's in the area of health or healthcare, and the impact nursing is having on that particular area. Be as specific as possible in terms of providing data to support the impact of your work, and ensure that the events listed in your CV, one more time, they align. It's in your CV, it's in this statement, it's discussed by your sponsors in one way or another. And again, you cannot exceed 600 words in this area, and if you exceed it, they'll cut it off. So please be focused. This is where your sponsor comes in, or your ghost sponsor comes in, to help you be sure that it's fine-tuned, that it is specific, that it really says what your contribution has been, and you can do that in 600 words.
And I want to add to this that for the editors in the group, this is where you can tap into your publisher's data about your journal. And so in your meetings with your publisher, your unique readers, the countries across the globe that read your journal, about altmetrics, about articles that are highly cited and perhaps how they might be used. So those are important metrics that you can incorporate to really identify that impact.
Next slide. Yeah. So actually then you're going to ask, what is impact? Well, it's the measure of tangible efforts or influence of your work or the entity that you've worked with, and the action that all of that has had on somebody else, some other group, some other process. And so impact is really important in terms of how and we've talked about this before. Pat talked about it in terms of putting the CV together. So you want to add to that, Pat?
No, I think the key is that if you don't talk about impact, you're missing the boat. So whether you, however you say it, you've got to have statements about impact. And it's best if you show it in your CV, and then you talk about it in your statements, and then your sponsors reiterate it, not in the same words, in different words, but talking about the same thing. You made a difference because you did whatever.
And so I want to share an example. If you're wondering, how in the world am I going to be able to document impact? Here's one example that I use when I work with colleagues. And that is, I encourage them to create an impact file. And in that impact file, as you see where your work has affected something else, just print out some document that helps to identify it. So for example, if I'm going to frame myself as making this major contribution in leadership, based upon work that I've done in publications that I've produced, I want to see how that major publication that I'm talking about, that seminal publication, how many times has it been cited? And how have others used that publication? And then you look at your citations and see how others have used that. I'm going to give you an example. I published a paper with my doctoral students. This was an outcome of a course that I taught, and it looked at the differences among quality improvement, research, and evidence-based practice. That continues to be a perennial issue in our discipline. And so we published this paper based on an assignment that the students did that looked at these different areas from different parameters. That paper has been cited extensively. And how has it been used? Institutions have created checklists to use that information from that manuscript to then guide their nurses in practice. So that's an example of perhaps how your work may have been used. And I found out about that because people were calling me to use components of that publication. And then when their publications came out, I could read to see and understand how they used that work. And so that went into the impact file. And I'm sure you have things like that that apply to your work. And the truth of the matter is that you don't always know your impact immediately, but if over time you've been keeping a file of that evidence, you can make a better argument relative to the impact of the work because you can see it and you can articulate it.
And Maria, David Odell asked the question of, am I accurate in my thinking that numbers, statistics, reflecting impact would be better than general statements that are not directly quantifiable? Yes, that is true. And also qualitative data are also helpful. So don't just discount qualitative, but yes, quantitative data where you can show thousands of people who responded or an impact factor or whatever it is that you want to be able to cite, that would be great. So that brings us to question 3. And again, this answer cannot exceed 200 words. And this is about, so what? What am I going to do in the future? Why should we invite you in? Are you just going to use these initials and that's it, you're done? No, we want you to be active. And so the question is about your significant contribution to support the mission of the Academy. So when you get to this question, open the page on the web that says Mission of the Academy and the pages that are devoted to the expert panels. Because you may look at the mission of the Academy and go, wow, that's pretty global. But if you look at the expert panels, you may say, oh my gosh, yes, I'm really big on breastfeeding, and I can see exactly what I would do here in terms of that particular expert panel. And so you look at what those words are. You don't want to parrot them back, but you want to use those words in responding to question 3. And you know how to do that, so I'm not going to spend more time on that. Here is homework assignment. You didn't think you were going to get homework assignment on just a little webinar, did you? But you'd be wrong. So for those of you who are going to apply, we want you to look at your CV and begin to update and edit your CV. If it is not in an impact statement, fix it. If you want to know what an impact CV might look like, please email me. Our emails are on the last page, These would be slides, not pages, on the last slide of our presentation. And I will send you what I used for a different organization, but it's the same kind of thing that shows impact. Put your CV into an impact format. For those of you who want to be sponsors, if the person that you are sponsoring has a plain old CV, work with them to get it into an impact statement. Whether you are applying to the Academy or you're going to be the sponsor, in one sentence, not to exceed 25 words. For those of you who are going to apply, state what your greatest contribution to nursing has been. For those of you who are sponsors, state what you think the person's greatest contribution to nursing has been. If those two things don't match, you need a big conversation about what the person's contribution has been. So if you have a sponsor and an applicant here, this would be great homework to do right after this meeting, to look at what does the CV look like and what would our 25 words about the candidate be like, so that we know how much work we have to do.
So this slide has a few key reminders, and they emphasize the importance of the sponsor statements and how they need to be aligned. Let me just share an example that operationalizes this statement. And so I sponsored a colleague whose major platform was basically building a specialty professional organization and its bold vision for the future. And some of the components of this person's leadership had been the work that this person had done, not only in credentialing, but also in the area of advancing healthy work environments. And so the two sponsors, I was sponsor one, and I focused on the credentialing piece and validation for the statement. And I had worked very closely with this person because she was the president of the national organization and I was chair of the certification body. And so as this person is claiming certain accomplishments, I could validate them because I was serving at the same time that this person was. The other part of the accomplishments had to be in advancing healthy work environments. Well, the president-elect with this person working directly with that board and at a national level was very familiar with this person's work and addressed the healthy work environment piece. The primary applicant application addresses the entire umbrella. And so we were able to, in each of our sponsor statements, not only validate what the application stated, but integrate it, help to support the integration of the various components. And that was an application that we worked on a year in advance together, planning with the two sponsors, basically collaborating to produce a very aligned product. So that's one example. And we talked also about the ghost reviewers that can help to do that.
Maria, that's a great point that you just made. So sometimes people have done a self-assessment and they realize that, for example, they had ideas or a manuscript in process and they decided to delay a year because they knew if they could get this next thing into print, it would make a much stronger case. So it's not like there's a specific timeline that you must do this. And sometimes you think, oh gosh, I really should do this like now. And if you look at what you're in the middle of and you think, that really could put it over, consider whether or not delaying for a year might not be to your advantage. And only you can answer that. But I know some people who have done that because the work that was in progress was like the whipped cream on the sundae.
Timing is important, no question about that. So we're going to get to the next slide that you'll see has our contact information if we can help anybody in terms of sorting out their thinking. We want to thank you all for joining us today and for engaging with us in this conversation and for your thoughtful questions and participation with us in this conversation. I know that we have been answering questions in the chat as we've been going along, but we'd like to open up at this point for any additional questions that you might have for us.
Sponsors as well as applicants.
I just, with the discussion about the CV, and I'm not sure who wrote it in the chat about, what to include. When I applied, and it's been a few years, they had specific instructions about the CV. Do they still have that? They had like what sections to have? Because I remember taking a lot of stuff out of mine to make it fit what they wanted. Has that changed?
It's not in the current guidance. They may add that. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
But they do have a page limit.
Yes.
Yep.
And in addition to the page limit, it would behoove you to have that CV be aligned with your narrative. And I got great advice from someone who said to me, do not expect that the reviewers of your application are going to go to the CV to validate anything. It needs to be in the narrative. Some people may do it, and if they go to validate anything, you're going to make it easy for them to validate that. But remember, there's 300 plus applications last year that are divided amongst a number of reviewers who are committed people. They're busy people
Right.
just like we are. And so we want to make their job more pleasant.
So I've had,
Linda?
thank you. Yes. So I've had people who are interested in being sponsored talk about how they should prepare their CV. And as I've sort of outlined, at least the process I use based on probably the same guidance that Leslie used. This was back in 2015. I did breed, some pages out of it. But they felt like things that happened, prior to 10 years ago weren't important. But then again, AAN is for a lifetime in nursing of achievement. So it isn't about this time frame that you're trying to just stick to. I mean, can you comment on that from your perspective?
Someone in the chat asked the question about do you suggest we only include in our CV the information that is relative to the application and remove the rest? So here's my advice. And if you're fairly young in the profession, and I can't remember what the page limit is for the CV. I think it's 20 pages. That could be totally wrong, but let's say 20. And you don't have 20 pages, you ought to put everything you have in there, because you don't want to submit 6 pages in comparison with somebody who's got 20 pages that keeps saying select publications, select work experience. So you want to have everything in there that you can. If your CV is 70 pages long, then yes, hone it down and use this principle. So what have you done for me recently? Isn't that what people care about? Now, the exception to that is when you are trying to make the case of since 02, meaning probably 1902, I have done this work and here it is. It's still ongoing. That would be a case where it would have been selected and you would have included that because you are showing this is really old and it is still sustainable.
Other questions?
just you're getting lots of praise in the chat, you know, very helpful. Thank you for the time. Thank you for this excellent information, extremely helpful information, really practical guidance for what seems to be an overwhelming process. And, you know, Andrea, I would agree. It was overwhelming, but I think that's part of the reason, to just reinforce what Karen and Pat and Maria said, is to start now. And then you can just work on it a little bit, you know, and kind of keep working on it and chipping away at it. It's funny, you know, when you look at the numbers, 600 words here, 300 words there, 100 words, you know, you're writing about 1,000 words, and you have to sort of like compress everything into this very small space, and it is overwhelming. But if you start early and you spend a lot of time thinking and you just chip away at it, I think it makes it manageable. You know, it's the old expression, you know, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? You know, it's sort of like, or every journey begins with a single step. You know, it's like, take that step and then the next day you take the next step. So.
And I always think of Mark Twain's statement, which is, I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have time. And that goes back to the point that we've been making, which is start early, because you think, oh, 600 words. Oh my gosh, how can I say this in 600 words? And then you start writing and you go, oh my gosh, I've got 9,000 words here. How do I get it down to 600? And that's the challenge of getting your story down to the 600 most critical words that you want to say, you know. So there's a reason you start early.
Just again, being practical for everybody, as Karen said, you know, you need to be an ANA member, or if you're international, you know, in an ICN organization. And then there's also an application fee, and it's not cheap. It's like $400, I think. So just to be prepared, you know, that you don't get surprised when you go to apply and you suddenly say, nobody told me I had to spend all this money. There is a fee. So, and it doesn't get refunded if you don't get accepted.
No, it doesn't.
Which is why you really want to do your very, very best so that you don't keep spending a lot of money every year.
Right.
Oh, you
And
know
then
what, Leslie, that's an excellent point. And so you could get down to the wire and you say, you know what, this is not my best work. And so you might decide, I'm going to save that money. I'm going to work on it for a year.
I'm going to wait a year.
And,
Yeah.
and then it'll be better and my money will be well spent.
And in full disclosure, once you submit the application and you get accepted, there are ongoing fees to be a fellow. And, you know, that's a professional decision that we all make. So any other questions?
Yeah, we have about 7 minutes, so we have time.
Well, hearing none, we want to go ahead and bring this webinar to closure. We want to thank you again for your participation and for your engagement. We wish you really well. And if you need to reach out to us, we provided our contact information, so please feel free to do so. And with that, we'll give you back the rest of your Friday and hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you
much.
all.
Thank you.
It's excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.